everybody. Nisambolo Binaka and warm Pacific greetings to everyone. It isn't a full room, so it's going to be a very intimate discussion. Welcome to our side event. My name is Salot Desongo, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Global Displacement at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which is an international human rights organization that partners with frontline communities to advance social justice and human rights. So I have the pleasure of being your facilitator this afternoon. We are co-hosting this event with a number of organizations, Coast Foundation from Bangladesh, Habitable, Hugo Observatory, UNU EHS, the Munich Re Foundation. So we had to sort of merge our side event to come up with side events. And this is one of the side events, of a series of side events that will be looking at human mobility. The previous panel that was just here provided a perfect segue to our side event. We'll be focusing very much on the human rights implications of climate displacement, climate migration, forced displacement, and planned relocation. So, Aminul, could you just click the next, the green button? There's a lot of emphasis in one of the previous panels that I was on around human mobility about the importance of narratives. And so you just heard me mention three terminologies: climate displacement, planned relocation, and climate migration. And I think it's really important to emphasize how distinguished each terminology means, because in the context of policies, it's really important that we develop policies that both address specifically these issues, but also runs coherently across these issues, because these issues are not always experienced in silo from each other at the front, in the front lines. Like communities don't or just go through planned relocation. You know, they usually are firstly displaced or are at risk of displacement before planned relocation, and there's human rights implications around that. But even within planned relocation, there's also human rights impacts, even if it's, you know, done well, so to speak. So that is providing these terminologies and how nuanced they are at the local level really sets up these discussions about human rights. What are the impacts that frontline communities are experiencing on the ground? How are these issues discussed at the policy level, and what are the possible strategies around this? So without further ado, we have a great panel. So the way we've structured this panel is that we are going to focus on, we're going to center human rights in our panel. So we're going to focus on frontline communities and their experiences. And like the previous panel, we're going to look at two regions, Bangladesh and the Pacific, before we then jump on to the policy priorities and challenges. So I've shared three questions with our panelists. The first question is going to be directed to our representatives from Bangladesh and then the Pacific. We'll start off first with our colleague from Bangladesh, and they're going to introduce themselves when they provide their responses. What are the key challenges and specific examples of human rights impacts in the context of climate migration, forced displacement, and planned relocation? So Aminul, sir, it's over to you.
Thank you, Salote, and greetings all. I will just present the scenario of Bangladesh as a case study to initiate the discourse on the displacement and key challenges. Bangladesh is one of the top 10 climate vulnerable countries, and latest it is ranked for 7 in climate vulnerable countries, because it is vulnerable due to its geographical location. This country is vulnerable due to its high population density, and also vulnerable due to lack of government capacity to adopt the resilient or adaptation activities as a poor country. So that is why. That's why every year Bangladesh has 1 million of people thousands of people are being displaced internally, and some people, a few percentages are going across the countries. This is a data where Bangladesh is faced every year displacement, and this data is collected from IDMC. And in the last year, we have seen that around 15 million people are displaced due to flood and cyclone and others. They are temporary displacement, and some people are forced for permanently displaced due to the river erosion and losing their lands and livelihood assets. We have all climatic driver that causes the displacement. We have cyclone, we have landslide, we have drought, we have waterlogging, and we have acute salinity, and all sort of climatic drivers are facing in Bangladesh, and that cause the displacement internally. Mostly people are poor people are sufferer, because according to our data, there are at least 20 million people, those are poor and living in the extreme vulnerable areas. While cyclone happen, people being displaced. While river erosion, people are being displaced. Among this, those are self-sufficient, they are maybe moved into the another areas. But those are poor, they don't have any scope to rehabilitate themselves with another place. That's why they are stay in their own areas with very hardship livelihood. And poor people among them, especially women and children, they are in the trap because they not move because their male person, he is the income owner, and they will move, but women and children, they are not able to move otherwise. What is the challenge? Challenge is very imperative because Bangladesh has a big, small land. You know, Bangladesh has around 1,200 people living in per kilometer. There's a high density population in the world. That's why while people are displaced, government has hardly faced how they are managed in, especially geographic location. And government has planned, he developed a lot of plan to manage the displacement, but they don't have adequate economic and financial capacity to manage the displacement. That's why it's very problem. Governments also draft some policies, internal displacement. This is the pressure by the UNFCCC, because if government has draw to the global attention for adaptation and displacement, they have to make a plan. That's why we think that government has drafted the National Displacement Management Policy. But in case of allocating the finance to implement the displacement management policy, we see that there is a big ignorance, lack of capacity for national budgetary allocations. What is the what is the way of the right-based solution? Because we think that Bangladesh has both the lack of capacity and geographical scope for displacement management, lack of financial capacity in this case. But we are always have a question that we are here for what? Because we are always looking the displacement issue is a human rights perspective. But we think that Declaration of Human Rights itself privileges the save of vulnerable people, but it's not working properly due to lack of political commitment, lack of appropriate support from the global development leader. That's why we need to think differently, because displacement due to climate impact, this is the different case where the different support and different mechanism, different strategies needed. If we always took the issue as a human rights perspective, it will depend on the political preference. If I like you, I will pay something. If I don't like you, I'll not something. As a climate change induced displacement, as a developed country is responsible for climate change, and that's why people are impacted and being displaced in different area and unable to manage their livelihoods through rehabilitation. So that's why they are responsible. That's why we look for different mechanism, and which is beyond the human rights perspective. We call it the obligatory, because you have to pay something for climate displaced management internally, for planned relocation, and external relocation must be support obligatory measures. We think this is the solution if we want to really look the climate-induced displacement as a human rights perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aminul. I think just to sort of recap some of the main things that I heard Aminul share was how human rights are disproportionately impacting people in poverty, riverine communities, in particular women, children, and older generations in Bangladesh. I also heard the initiative to develop a national disaster management policy in Bangladesh, and I think it's one of the few countries that actually have something that looks into human mobility and how to address that at the national level. And I think, you know, listening to Aminul talk about how a human rights-centered approach should not result in squattering, I think that is the context that we're looking at. Like, what is a human rights approach and what does that look like at the local level, but what does that mean at the policy level? And that's the question that is a challenge. It's a complex and very sensitive issue to address at the political level, but it's actually quite simple when we look at it from a frontline community perspective. It should not be squattering. And I think even in the context of the Pacific, where one of our partners always says that picking fruit is not climate justice, and that is the same sentiment from Aminul. And I think just he's emphasizing the obligatory nature of how to address this issue. Developed countries with high emissions should be responsible, and that is climate justice. That aligns with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Polluter must pay, and that is the context. So thank you so much, Aminul, for sharing that. We'll now jump to the Pacific, a context that is quite unique from Bangladesh, but also offers another perspective of human rights issues in addition to what Aminul has shared. So I'll ask our speaker from the Pacific to share. Aminul, could you pass the clicker to, please?
Hello, everyone. My name is Celita Pulini. I'm the Pacific Coordinator for Loss and Damage Youth Coalition and also founder of Pacific Network Loss and Damage. My stance on human rights in the Pacific context, as you can see, human rights must protect our Pacific people against climate crisis, which interferes fundamental freedoms and undermine their human dignity. However, on this context, the definition of human rights in the Pacific contradicts what we have here and what is implied of our human rights on our Pacific people. Where human rights is supposed to be is inherited and inalienable, this has been compromised by our Pacific people. They are being forced out of their homes in times of disaster, in times of cyclones, in times of heavy rainfall. When places are subjected to flooding, they are being forced to move to higher grounds or to safer places in order to safeguard themselves from the turmoil or the disaster that's happening around them. Recently, we've been facing a lot of changes in our environment. There's been changes in rainfall, as you can see on the first picture that was earlier last month. we had a heavy downpour in Fiji, and a lot of low-lying places were flooded. On the second picture, you could see that was years back at where families were forced to shelter in the caves because there was a landslide at where they were staying, and this is up in the highlands. In the Pacific, we have a cause of sea level rise. As you can see in the picture, the shorelines have shifted in, and houses by the shorelines and families or communities are forced to go to higher grounds from where they used to live. We've had a series of intensive cyclones in the Pacific. The first few pictures there are 2 Category 5 cyclones which happened in Fiji. One was Cyclone Winston back in 2016, and the next one was 4 years later, which was Cyclone Yasa. Earlier, 2 months ago, Vanuatu had experienced a Category 5 cyclone, Cyclone Lola, and the impacts have been devastating on communities and also individual families on where they had to fend for themselves or shelter themselves since their place has been destructed. In Tuvalu, in the last session, there was a panelist, a youth, who had shared about the experiences of Tuvalu. This was a report that was brought about by the Ministry of Finance when we held a discussion on loss and damage dialogue for the PCIDs back in Samoa in July. For them, climate change impact is not like what we are facing in Fiji and Vanuatu, where we are facing severe Category 5 cyclones, but for them, they are facing severe droughts. And they've been facing longer drought periods, and with that, they have been faced with issues on having to fish longer distance away from land, or there's been less fish in the reef, and there's also a problem of no access to sanitary fresh water. So we can see on these impacts, their human rights, their rights to a safer environment, sustainable environment is being compromised or is being taken away from them. That is on the issue of climate displacement. However, I'll move on to climate relocation, where countries around the world are facing the devastating impacts of cyclones or weather conditions. We have resorted to the last resort, where some of our communities have resorted to relocation. This is a community in Vanuatu, in Fiji, where their former settlement was by the coastal area. Due to excessive sea level rise and water flooding into their communities, they have been forced to relocate to higher grounds. And their new communal setting is not the same as how they used to experience when they were by the coastal area. There are other places too in Fiji and also other Pacific. In Fiji, currently there have been 6 relocations, community relocations, domestic relocations, and there are another line of 20 communities, which is in the line of prioritized communities to be relocated, and the projection after having assessment on vulnerable communities in Fiji, there are about 800 communities that are due for relocation in the near future. For as much as we want to remain in our ancestral grounds, and especially as we know, for us in the Pacific, we hold our culture at heart. One of the things that we pride ourselves in is our attachment to land. That is our identity. In this climate crisis where communities are being relocated, that is one of the things that's been taken away from them. And from there, in the line of human rights, their right to land, their right to ownership has been compromised as well. In other places in the Pacific, as I had mentioned, in Tuvalu and also other small islands like Kiribati, they have been facing the same thing. There are two communities in Fiji that were relocated from Tuvalu and also Tuvalu and Kiribati. Tuvalu, the settlers of Tuvalu who came from Tuvalu are now in Kiowa, and also the settlers that came in from Rambi 70 years ago from Kiribati are now settled in Rambi Island in Fiji. Having migrated from their home to a new place, now they're facing a second catastrophe, or they're being traumatized on the second time on having to deal with these climate issues in terms of migration. The places where they're settling in are facing these climate impacts of coastal erosion, high sea level rise. That is in fact very traumatizing to the community, especially to men and also to women and children, on having to deal with that on the second time. Those are just a few of the stories, but then since most of the communities in Fiji and also around the Pacific are by the coastal area, the stories are the same on the impacts that they face and the losses that they face and having to deal with. And the saddening thing is it puts their health at risk, food security, and employment, all that they are supposed to have access to is being compromised due to this climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Selita. So I think something unique that Selita brought up is the context of historical displacement. She mentioned two communities that have already gone through forced displacement due to exploitation, capitalism, colonialism, but also planned relocation. And how human rights impacts were affected in those scenarios. She mentioned existing trauma that communities have had to live with. So, we can look at this issue through an intergenerational equity lens as well. That trauma doesn't just go away, it's passed down from generation to generation through stories, through experiences. So what does this human rights-centered approach look like now in the context of addressing these crisis that's been building up over the years, but also compounds existing social and economic and political issues. 800 communities that need to be relocated in 2023 in one island with a population of less than 1 million. So we have to look at the resources and the support that this country needs, which is Fiji, the country of Fiji, and what does that look like for other countries in the Pacific, a country that emits less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. So again, back to Almin's point of responsibility and accountability. And so thank you so much, Selita, for sharing the context of the Pacific. I guess we can move on now to sort of the regional policy landscape. And I'd like to now invite Dr. Melanie Pill to provide sort of your perspective on some of the regional challenges and priorities.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Thank you so much, and also thank you for having me on the panel today. So what I'm going to present to you today is probably some of the challenges and governance priorities within certain countries. So Dr. Himanshu will later talk about our climate academy that we ran this year, and these cases are specific cases from different regions, all showcasing different challenges but also opportunities, how to deal with planned relocations in particular, making sure that human rights are considered. So one of the studies explored, and I'm presenting here on behalf of some of the participants of the Climate Academy. One of the studies explored the intersection between planned relocation as an adaptive response or loss and damage, specifically looking at the Pacific. And no matter how well planned relocation is undertaken or how well it was planned, there will always be loss. There will always be non-economic loss. And that is intangible and very personal. And we have just heard, in the Pacific in particular, people are connected to their land and vice versa. So that makes it really challenging to even internally relocate people, like in the example from the village in Bunidugoloa in Fiji. And it makes it even harder if you move people across boundaries. So one thing that is really important is that once people are being relocated, there needs to be an establishment of a life that is normal, going back to routine. This includes just setting up of schools, cooking facilities, or simply footpaths for families to bring food back to their houses. And Fiji has also established or developed their planned relocation guidelines and has developed some standing operating procedures, and they will help in the future to ensure that planned relocation is done more successfully than in the past. Another example from the Americas is the Southern Common Market established the Specialized Forum on Migration, as well as the Declaration of Principles on International Refugee Protection. And this forum helped for information exchange and dialogue between the countries that are part of it, and helped, for example, easier international migration and management, especially in the context of disasters, and is also increasingly recognized in the context of climate change and environmental factors. One really positive example is that Argentina in particular developed the environmental humanitarian visa for people displaced by socio-natural disasters in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And it recognizes that displaced people are particularly vulnerable and that human rights need to be included in the relocation process. Another study that we looked at is a review of displacement policies in the Southeast Asia region. Countries were Bangladesh, the Philippines, Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Nepal, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, and China. Overall, specific laws and policies are still uncommon. However, what was interesting is there was a widespread treatment of displacement across disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation frameworks. Most interesting, Bangladesh, Vanuatu, and Indonesia have policies with explicit human rights language, while Nepal and the Philippines reference the guiding principles on internal displacement. So that means that there is awareness of human rights violations in the context of displacements, but also that it is increasingly being addressed in frameworks that are developed for planned relocation or displacement in general. A positive was that each country made reference to evacuation and protection measures in laws and policies, again highlighting the importance of human rights in the context of displacement. However, human rights-based approaches are often not followed or implemented, not because we don't want to, but due to budget and resource constraints, and that is especially the case in the Pacific. Another case study is from communities in Ghana, where major parts of their land surface was inundated, and therefore a seawall was built to protect the coastal settlements. However, the seawall still required for the communities to be resettled. It was in situ, which means that it was very close to where they usually lived, but nevertheless they had to resettle their houses and had to move into a new locations. The problems there were that there were actually no existing frameworks in place. Also found that there was corruption, poor quality of housing construction because it was all done in a rush and in a haste, as well as nepotism. So these are all, some of the case studies really show us that there are steps into the right direction, that human rights are being considered, that it is, there is the awareness that there is vulnerable people that are affected by human rights violations when planned relocations are undertaken. But also, some of these cases are scattered. We haven't shared them widely yet, and there are also still many lessons that can be learned. What is clear that each case is unique and very context specific, so it might make it really hard that we have an overarching framework for all planned relocation that works in every single context. But, and that will also show some of the research that we did in the Climate Change Academy, a human-centered approach in order to consider human rights is absolutely needed and crucial. Then policies, frameworks and laws need to be in place, such as the Pacific Relocation Guidelines or the principles that have been established in the Americas. Corruption, nepotism and political favoritism need to be addressed. It is still an issue when it comes to these projects, and we cannot shy away from addressing that and really making it clear, bring it to the forefront. Also, adequate financial resources and capacities are needed. If that is not in place, unfortunately, the social component always falls short. Consultation with communities is key, and international agreements are required for cross-border migration, like the example in the Americas has shown with Argentina, but also the most recent example in the Pacific for migration pathways to Australia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pill. That was enlightening, and we look forward to learning more about the results of your work. But also, I think, my heart kind of jumped a little when you started mentioning all those positive things, but then it sort of went down again when you shared that, like as in many cases, the implementation and following those what exists is an issue because of the lack of resources. But I think you also highlighted something very important, which is, the importance of ensuring that there's a working political and democratic process in place, an important legal framework in place to actually make sure that the processes that are required in a human rights-based approach are actually followed through to address issues like corruption and nepotism. And so, looking at civil and political rights and the importance of advancing that at the local grassroots level is really important, particularly in countries where those rights are already, affected and trampled on. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Pill. So we'll move on to Doha, our guest from Bangladesh, who also has to offer some regional priorities from Bangladesh.
Thank you very much, and ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to all of you. Let me start with some frustration, then we'll gradually move to the hope. The frustration is that if we recall the first IPCC assessment report published in 1991, it says that the most impact of climate change will be human movement or migration. So That would be the foremost and one of the challenging impact of climate change. After that, we have traveled many years, 3 decades, and till now we don't have any plans, any policies, any programs recognized by the UNFCCC, also by the development partners and multilateral donors to address the impacts of climate change in relation to displacement and migration. That is the frustration, because over the years, science has established that migration and displacement is happening everywhere, in every country, due to impacts of climate change, because impacts of climate change are increasing. The problem is that when we talk about displacement and migration, there are 2 different perspectives, at least to me. One is displacement, another is migration. So displacement is always forced. I mean, displacement is connected to disasters. And the disasters are not natural. Disasters are human-induced. When we talk about climate change-induced disasters, all the disasters are human-induced. For instance, if I consider cyclone in Caribbean, also in Bangladesh, and also riverbank erosion in Bangladesh, there is an additionality of global warming, that the impact of cyclone or impact of riverbank erosion, impact of monsoon flooding have increased, and that are causing, forcing people to be displaced and then migration. Sometimes we try to say that migration is voluntary. Of course, migration is voluntary, but people are forced to take a voluntary decision because they don't have any option at the origin to do. For instance, in Bangladesh, in the coastal areas, many people are migrating gradually. There is no disaster because salinity intrusion is not considered as a disaster. So there is a loose connection to slow onset event to disasters, yet slow onset events are the dominant drivers of migration, but they are not recognized because they are not connected to disasters. On the other hand, when we talk about migration, this is not just internally displaced or internally migrated, because migration, sometimes we call this is influenced by pull factors. If there is an opportunity, people will migrate for livelihood, for better jobs and opportunities. But when they migrate from one place to another place, this is entire story of human rights violation, because when they migrate from climate change affected areas to the urban slums for better jobs, they can't do a better job. They can't get better wages. Women are trapped in urban insecurity situation. They are not getting access to basic services. They don't have access to education, health, and other facilities. Children are forced to involve in child labor. There are many evidences of child marriage in the coastal areas and in the riverbank erosion-prone areas, because in the displaced communities or migrated families, adolescent girls are considered as risk because they are easy prey to sexual harassment, violations, and others. And parents consider to marry off the adolescent girls as a mechanism of risk transfer. So we know all the things. But when we talk about human rights issues, we become mum, because human rights is something different, something difficult. And when we talk about human rights in the national context, national political leadership are not agreed to accept any obligation of human rights violation, because national governments always try to say that they are very clean, they are not doing any human rights violation. And national governments is trying to put fingers to the developed countries because the human rights violation in the context of climate change is not for themselves. They should not be liable for human rights violation in the context of climate change because they are not causing climate change impact and other things. On the other hand, developed countries are saying that this is national responsibility because national governments is obliged by many international UN treaties like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenant of Cultural and Human Rights. So national government has the responsibility to safeguard rights of all citizens. Be this for development activities, be this for climate change, be this for other issues. So there is a blame game or shifting responsibilities from one to another, that nobody is accepting human rights violation of the climate change migrated people and communities. So this is another frustration because there is many cases, many concerns of human rights violation in national context. People are migrating from one place to another place. they're facing human rights violation, but they cannot claim their rights to the national government, also to the international government, because we don't have any international, agreement or international legal instrument for respecting or safeguarding rights of the climate change migrants. Now, going to the regional paradigm, there is also cross-border migration between Bangladesh and India, between maybe India and Nepal, between Pakistan and other countries. So cross-border migration is increasing because there are huge uprooted population in the national context. So if they fail to get job in the national context, they try to find jobs somewhere else, maybe in India from Bangladesh, maybe in Middle East, or maybe in European countries. And if you go to the newspaper article, you will find that many Bangladeshis are helplessly dying when they try to cross Mediterranean illegally by boat, because they're helpless. They are uprooted from their ancestral home. They don't have any job facilities. They don't have agricultural land to do agricultural activities. So they are trying to helplessly migrate to other countries. And in the course of cross-border migration, the entire story is human rights violation. This is exploitation of labor, this is exploitation of money, exploitation of resources, this is sex trading and other things. So we should not be mum, and we should not leave the developed countries and also the national government not taking actions and activities for addressing those climate change-induced human rights violations. The concern is that when we saw that there is no response from the national government and also not response from the international community, Bangladeshi civil societies, we are advocating for this since maybe 2 decades, and we are failing to, agree national government and also the international government for a legal instrument for respecting or safeguarding human rights. Now we went to the other international protocols, because we have Universal Declaration on Human Rights under the United Nations system, and with the Bangladeshi civil societies, around 17 or 18 civil societies put a submission to the United Nations, because Bangladesh is going to have its 4th periodic review on Universal Declaration on Human Rights, so that we can at least introduce some human rights issues, human rights elements in the context of climate change to the 4th periodic review of Bangladesh on Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So we put a submission, a group of civil society did this, we made a presentation to the United Nations that we should not ignore human rights violation of the climate vulnerable people. And that submission has been accepted by the UN system, and many of the elements has been considered for further action, and one of the elements is displacement and migration. And there is a strong directives to the national government, also directive to the international government to support national government, so that the national government make a proper accounting of climate change induced migrants or displaced people. National government ensure alternative livelihoods for the climate change induced displaced and migrated people, and also ensure basic rights, human rights to those people. So our concern is that with the civil societies, there are many limitations of working in, official system, maybe under the UNFCCC, maybe under the national government, but still we have some scopes and opportunities to flag this issue to the international level, maybe other systems, under other legal instruments. So my argument should be that we should explore other opportunities to flag in human rights violation in the context of climate change, maybe not under the UNFCCC. Still we should continue our pressure or advocacy under the UN system, UNFCCC, but also should explore other options so that we can at least ensure or safeguard rights of the climate change displaced and migrated communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doha. I think we all share your frustration, and we're inspired by it as well. I think increasingly across the world, we're seeing litigation as a tool to address climate change issues. So it's really important that this issue of climate force displacement also has opportunities, like you mentioned, to actually get some results. And I think you build on what Dr. Pil mentioned about how there are existing policies, but the lack of, I guess, responsibility that should be shared between the international community and the government of Bangladesh, and the need to make sure that that happens through resources and more political will, I suppose. So thank you so much for that. We'll now jump on to some key advocacy messages for COP28 specifically. You know, there's very specific agenda items that are being addressed here. Climate mobility is not one of them, but it intersects across all of these issues. So I'd like to pass it on now to Himanshu from the UNU EHS to sort of identify, you know, what those are, and then we'll ask the other panelists to join in.
Thanks a lot, Salota. Greetings, everyone. Greetings of the day. My name is Himanshu Shekhar. It's a pleasure to be with you, and also greetings to the audience joining us online. At United Nations University Institute, I hope I'm audible. Just give me a sec. Yeah, all right. Thank you so much. At United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, we strive to supplement and complement the global policy making process on climate change. And this year we spent a year along with our amazing partners from Munich Foundation and in collaboration with the Climate Change Secretariat, UNFCCC, and the Global Data Institute of International Organization on Migration, IOM, to understand a very specific issue which is extremely sensitive, that is of planned relocation. An issue that has time and again has not received, and for very right reasons, the faith, the trust that is now very imperative. Given the extremes of climate change, mean people will have to move. And it's our responsibility as experts in the room, as policymakers, as practitioners, to ensure when we do that in a dignified way, we do that in a timely way, and we do that in a way that people feel part of it. So Salute, thanks a lot. Very first question you had was pretty much along the line of what the first recommendation is. What we have done, I won't take much of time. So we invited experts like Melanie. I'm very pleased to have her with us here. Also, we had Danang in the room from Raoul Wallenberg Institute earlier. So some 27 experts from across the world who work specifically on the issue of planned relocation in different contexts. And our work will be feeding the climate change policy making process as well. And we are presenting 5 key insights from what we have received from there. As we know, particularly at COP, language matters. So we have tried to be as precise. So I would not like to paraphrase what is written. The very first recommendation is planned relocation generates many positive impacts. It's a very positive way of spinning something. I would say, with all honesty, that for a long has not been very positive. But we feel that by putting people at the very center of it, from the very beginning, from designing, from implementation, it can have a positive impact of something that is going to be harsh, something that is going to be harmful at the end of the day. We need to ensure that the affected people and communities are involved in all decisions, and we build on the local knowledges and systems and practices. Here I would like to go slightly tangential and come back to the very first question that Saloti and panelists addressed. Like the human rights in planned relocation, along with all other cases of induced migration we talked about, lie at the center of it. In one of the work that PDD did, and we had representatives from PDD here as well, that more than 50% of communities that have had any form of planned relocation come from indigenous communities. So while we talk about human rights, we have to be extremely sensitive about the rights specifically of the indigenous communities. And how do we ensure that is also taken care of? That's a very significant subset. I also wanted to bring your attention to something called FIRE. That's a framework for integrating rights and equality, and that has been prepared by our amazing colleagues at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And they work on how do you ensure that these intricate issues, these sensitive issues can be integrated with the larger climate change policy making process. So please have a look, and we are happy to share more afterwards. So now quickly going into second part, and particularly that is the part I am more associated with a clear national framework or guidelines on planned relocation. that are designed with inputs from affected people can help governments and supporting them, the actors, to safeguard the rights of individuals and communities. A clear national framework. We have seen certain cases. Fiji is definitely a torchbearer. We are also seeing cases of inspiration coming from Bangladesh and elsewhere. But unless we ensure there is a integrated policy approach across scales, from the global to national to regional, all the way to local, our efforts would only go so far and would always remain piecemeal. Third is planned relocation, and if I may say, all related migration process, human mobility process are long-term process. There is space if we had to carefully discuss whether you call it long-term or not. It could be, a bit of pessimistic approach, but the reality is these things take time. So we have to be very cognizant of it in terms of proactive planning, long-term commitment, including funding and actors and sustainability, so that the support goes beyond the physical relocation of people and households. The fourth, I forgot to mention, there is a QR code, and I hope it works. It used to work, so it still should. To the policy brief that we have prepared, I'm just presenting the 5 key messages. So please feel free to have a look if your time and internet permits. So the fourth one is government and affected communities often differ in their perceptions, and that's very natural. We have to be cognizant of it. I'm very excited that we have also the partnership here for this event from Habitability, because the whole question of what is habitable for me might be completely different from Melanie. So a central question of human rights is my right to move or my right to not to move as well. So this question of habitability becomes a very central issue. So the government and affected communities, they often differ in their perceptions and assessment of the need of relocation due to climate risk. These differences need to be carefully considered in the planning stage. And last one, I would reiterate what Melanie earlier said. There will be losses. It's a process that needs careful consideration. It also needs a very sentimental, a sensitive approach, because how much best we try, there will be losses. If we start planning with that in mind, I hope we will be more careful, and our efforts would enhance well-being in the long term. Do I still have? Yes. So of course we are very happy to hear more. We had the whole 1 year of events on understanding planned relocation. So this QR code, if you scan, would lead you to the sessions we had, particularly the virtual ones. There is a whole YouTube list of 11 events that we organized. And thanks a lot. Amazing listening to all of you. Salute back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Himanshu. Thank you so much for emphasizing the unique rights of indigenous peoples, women's rights, children's rights, the rights of people living with disabilities. I think this is really important to bring out as we're talking about human rights-centered approaches. It's not just a blanket, tick in the box. We need to really look at the specific rights that are unique to these populations that have disproportionately impacted. I think as you were talking through the 5 recommendations, they all center affected communities. And I think that should speak for itself, like a human rights-based approach definitely centers and requires the feedback, the input of those that are most affected. And I think that, a lot of the demands around the Loss and Damage Fund is highlighting the need to include people in migration, refugees, and that's a particular call from the migration community in addition to those other populations. I think Dr. Himanshu also identified a very important aspect in one of the recommendations around proactive planning. Resources are not designed to, take care of people that are not yet at risk. And I think that needs to fundamentally change when we're looking at climate migration, forced displacement, and planned relocation. We can't wait for people to be displaced before we start dispersing funds, because they need resources now. And of course, highlighting the complexity of these issues again, but also the fact that no community is the same. These, even within specific populations, indigenous peoples, they are not monolithic. So it's really important as we're designing policies and as governments are looking at these recommendations to go back to these different constituencies and talk to them and, like the recommendations mentioned, ask for their feedback and include them proactively in the planning. And of course, relocation is inevitable, and we know that. A human rights-centered approach does not equal planned relocation. It just means that how we approach it should be sensitive, and we should be looking at this from a human perspective, taking care of each other, building trust and solidarity. So we still have 34 minutes, thank God. All the panels that I've been in ran over time, and I was told to keep quiet. So maybe some last few words from all of our panelists, starting from Doha, about what you're hoping realistically to come out of COP28 to address some of the complex issues that you've mentioned.
No, in relation to COP28, not only COP28, in the previous COP, I didn't find any hope. Because if we recall the COP decision of Cancun COP16 in 2010, there was a particular paragraph for addressing displacement and migration, para 45F. After that, we thought that we will get everything under the sun from loss and damage discourses, compensation, displacement, migration, many money will flow to the developing countries. So we compromised all the things to get loss and damage fund, and we also compromised that decision. And there's few wording in relation to displacement and migration under the loss and damage discourses. On the other hand, there is a trickery of the developed countries because they diverted all the discourses and they take out all the discourses from UNFCCC process to sideline activities. For instance, Nansen Initiative, for instance, platform on disaster displacement, that all are the distracting mainstream discussion of the UNFCCC to the other stream. And we're happy that there is a bilateral discussion is happening. We will get some resources out of this, but no resources came. There are just some papers developed by the Nansen initiatives, and I hope that platform on disaster displacement also will come with some papers, not with the practical solution of addressing climate change, addressing displacement migration. So my persuasion and advocacy to the national governments to make a fresh submission under the UNFCCC so that it has been included as a standalone agenda item for addressing climate change induced displacement migration. Unless having a standalone agenda item under the UNFCCC, we will not claim anything from the national or from the national government and also from the international community. The sideline approach, what has been advocated since many years, as I said, Nansen initiatives, platform on disaster displacement, to me, they are useless and they are just distracting the global argument, civil society argument from UNFCCC process to somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doha. Aminu?
No, thanks. I am not, I don't say anything.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Himanshu?
Thanks a lot. No, indeed, I think having a dedicated or at least a specific agenda item, that would be one way to go. I personally found the discussion of opening the loss and damage, particularly whether under adaptation and migration, again at this COP, to be interesting, and that is something I would have, I feel would have long-lasting implication on where migration ultimately lands at, in terms of not only the science of it, but the funding patterns as well. So I think that is something definitely to watch for. My wish for this amazing group of people in the room is that let's start where we can. If you come from a science or academia background, like maybe United Nations University or some of us, let's ensure that we have the baseline to define what is needed when what is needed. There are attribution studies to avail the funding when it becomes available. If we look at the global stocktake initially summary that came, we still see that mobility, if we look at the larger issue, is conspicuously absent from most of the country's submissions. It's an issue that has come up time and again in the National Adaptation Plan and NDCs as well. So can we ensure that our work ensures that at least the party I represent or the institution I represent ensures that it is represented? And last thing would be a bit of announcement. We also have a dedicated event on this on 10th of December from 8:45 to 18:45 to 20 hours. That's 6:45 to 8 p.m. at the Climate Mobility Pavilion. So please stay tuned there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Pill.
Thank you so much for this really enlightening and amazing panel event. And I want to echo what Dr. Himanshu said, but also I think what you mentioned is that we need to use those positive examples, that there is already work out there that we can make use of and also be inspired by. And for this COP in particular, I think it's really important that we have frameworks and policies and those agreements in place so that we have a path, that we have rules and procedures that can be adhered to, that people have guiding principles like the ones that came out of the Climate Academy. I also think that developed countries need to step up and recognise that there will be and already are actually people moving also across borders, that we need to have developed country recognising that there will be people moving from their countries and into other countries. That's another thing I think that really needs to be recognised also here at this COP. And I would also like to say a provision of planned relocation or migration in the operationalisation of the Loss and Damage Fund, which also includes funding for planned relocations or displacement, but also considering non-economic losses that come from that. So thank you.
Thank you. Selita?
Thank you. I believe a lot has been said by my colleagues here. I'll just talk on my area, which is of loss and damage, and also my work which surrounds around grassroots communities. What I expect out of COP is a positive response in terms of addressing the issues of loss and damage and economic and non-economic loss and damage, that both be prioritized. I'm saying this because a lot of assessments, a lot of issues arises on non-economic loss and damage that evacuates from the communities. So in that case, and also in terms of relocation from these grassroots communities, that they be provided resources in terms of mobility and other aspects that are attached with it, which is of food security, employment, and health, which is the basic needs that is needed within these communities. So in terms of the outcomes of COP, that most of these issues and most of the assistance that comes addresses the needs of the communities, and whatever approaches that's been in place is bottom-up approach, because grassroots communities would know best what's good for them in terms of their livelihood and welfare.
Thank you so much. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. So we now have time for Q&A. We have our wonderful supporters from the UNFCCC walking around with a mic. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Tilley. I come from the United Kingdom and manage a behaviour change communication company. I may have missed it because we came in slightly late, but on your 5 key insights, the one area that appears to be missing, and again, my apologies if I've missed this, is any work with the host communities. So all the focus is on those migrants, those people actually moving. But I think it's just as important that there's a same amount of work provided for the host communities who've got to receive them and understand the benefits of taking these additional people on, rather than them being seen as an additional burden on already tight resources.
Thank you for that question. Is there another question? We can probably take questions before we respond to that. Okay. Maybe Dr. Himanshu and Dr. Phil can answer that?
Yeah, very quickly. No, without doubt, excellent question. And by all means, we employ the host community. I very much take your point. that the host community needs to be more explicit in terms of policy approach as well. But definitely that is just one way of looking at how policy recommendations, particularly from the human rights perspective, could be done. But the very first recommendation we have, we hope to break it down further, and that's what we aim to do at the event on the 10th. But I fully reckon the point you have made, and we fully agree with that.
Alicia?
Hi, I'm Alicia Wallace from Equality Bahamas, and the Bahamas is a very small country, very tiny islands, very, very low-lying, and I'm thinking about relocation and what we will eventually experience, and wondering if any of you can share anything about plans or anything that has been emerging around the preservation and continuation of culture once people have relocated. I mean, we're only 400,000 people in the Bahamas. What's that going to look like if we end up somewhere massive? And also, any planned responses or contingency, anything around additional crisis, like things like gender-based violence increasing when crises like climate crises move people and put them in different kinds of situations, especially in terms of housing and entering into a completely different kind of society.
Thank you, Alicia. Who wants to take that? Doha?
No, this is very, critical discussion and discourse. When we talk about displacement and migration, we often say that they compromise their many basic rights, even the cultural rights also. But in the course of displacement and migration, I didn't find any activities or initiative that the communities and also the local government authorities take an action to, respecting, even preserving cultural rights. So this has not been, even in the discussion in the national context.
Yeah, an excellent question, and and probably already also a very hard one to answer. But if we maybe look at those guiding principles or the key recommendations, it could be something that can be discussed with the community as well. So you consult with the community how they might be able to take some of that cultural heritage with them. What could be some of the measures that you could implement to mitigate those losses, because like we've identified, there will be losses, and oftentimes that is actually cultural loss, this connection to what you had before, and even to your home, to your life. So that will always be lost in some way. And consulting with the community, actually down to the individual level, might help to alleviate some of that loss, if possible. In my opinion, it has to be a consultation with the community itself, because it is so context-specific, so personal, that I don't think there could be an overarching rule on how to do it. Yeah.
I'll speak in the context of the Pacific. At this moment, we are looking towards cultural preservation, whereby, for instance, in Fiji, most of our cultural practices or things revolving around culture is being stored digitally in the museum. I think the same goes for Tuvalu as well. For the Banabans, those that are in Rambi, their cultural, they're preserving their culture. There is this museum in New Zealand. They've opted to preserve some of their cultural items and values, which has been recorded. They've managed to contact or provide, get those recordings preserved there. And the same is happening for other islands in the Pacific, and also with this emerging loss and damage and waste financing that's been rising. However, they've they are on the process of allocating some of those loss and damage funding into preserving their culture and also finding innovative ways in which they can do that.
Can I just add on to that? So I think there was a second part of your question about displacement and, for example, increased, especially also gender-based violence. And I've actually done a study in the Caribbean that looked specifically at non-economic losses after extreme weather events, and that was particularly the hurricane season in 2019. And there is, I actually found that things like that, as a non-economic loss, they are not even included in the UNFCCC definitions. So there's actually, I think, an expansion that is required that really recognises gender violence after extreme weather events and the devastation in the islands, but there's also crime that is increasing that's not really captured. So all of these impacts, they almost still need to be identified in order to be able to address them.
Thank you so much for those responses.
This is Ashish from Helvetica Swiss Inter Corporation. So brilliant discussions. Okay, there are a lot of evidences from the ground on displacement and migration. And on the other hand, this is really sad. And I will say that this is shame for us that in this UNFCCC venue COP28 side event, we are talking about the process beyond the UNFCCC mechanism. Our speakers are talking about the UPR and other processes. So it means that this UNFCCC mechanism and process are completely a failure and broken system. However, keeping our last resort of hope, what will be your recommendations or suggestions to challenge this system, this mechanism, these processes to ensure right, fair, and just actions for the climate-induced migrants and the displaced people? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. There's another question here. Perhaps we can take 2 questions before we respond to that.
Thank you for the opportunity. Mine is just an addition to the fact that you're talking about the losses. The loss and damage goes beyond materials that you're talking about. For example, a child who got displaced, got separated, lost the parents, lost the language, lost the origin. So, something that is beyond the materials that we're talking about. It's just a human being on earth but doesn't know where he or she belongs. So when you're doing these discussions, it has to go extremely deeper into just one element of material to really looking at an aspect of a human being. Yes, I think that's what I want to say.
Absolutely. Thank you. Do you have any more questions before our panelists respond? Okay, Aminu?
Just I want to a short response of Ashish because we have to analyze is how the UNFCCC discourse since the inception turned to from the humanitarian aspect turned into business instrument. Because this is our feelings and analysis. The UNFCCC process now turned into a business instrument for development country. That's why we feel that all hope are end in the UNFCCC process, and we have to make a separate measures that are already demanded. And we also demand in the morning in the press conference, we demand a separate measures and how it will be developed and how it will be start, who will start. Of course, we are MBCs and vulnerable countries, those we are facing the displacement, we have to call for a separate measures that will be beyond the UNFCCC process. This is my assumption. Thank you.
If I can quickly add to it, being a part of the process myself, I think it's a process that definitely needs a lot more pace, a lot more energy, and a lot more commitment. What I would say that, of course, we have seen the word climate action being talked more about, and I think that's where the cue lies. How, if I can understand your question more as how do we strengthen the process that we have, I think the climate battle would be won at the local level. The UNFCCC process is designed to provide an overarching guidance where we are, of course, lagging extremely behind. From 2010 Cancun, where the mobility was explicitly talked about, to now, a lot could have been done. We have not been able to do. But my personal wish as a researcher, as someone in the policy domain, is that I feel that we need a lot more evidence. We need lot more, not only finance and commitment, but also evidence to ensure whatever is out there, can we make most of it. Quite often we have seen that when policies are actually coming to funding, simply due to lack of attribution, these things don't go forward. Even when, in the extreme scenario, when you have the commitment, you have the support. So one thing I would love to do a bit more would be some more scientific work to ensure that these things can be taken further. I share your sentiment. I try to remain hopeful.
All right, do we have any more questions? Wonderful. Well, I think just to conclude, I think in response to the questions, you know, I would want to first address this question about including host communities. I think that's absolutely necessary. They also have a right to inform, you know, decisions that affect their livelihoods and their home. But I think we also need to recognize, you know, the rising sentiments of xenophobia and racism, particularly against migrants of color. It's happening already around the world, and the need to approach that sensitively. And I think as civil society, our role is to look at, you know, what the risks are to human beings and human lives, and to look at the existing social inequities that already exist, and try to avoid perpetuating some of those risks. So, you know, we have to look at both sides and be careful, but absolutely host communities definitely need to be part of the process. I also think that as it relates to, you know, these increasing crises, in addition to the climate crisis, that perhaps is a consequence that we have to ensure that we design in our legal and political and civil processes. Like I mentioned, like Dr. Pills mentioned in her research, the importance of looking at this issue holistically and not just segmented. We can't just look at habitats and environmental rights. We need to look at society as a whole, and ensure that the rights of all peoples, all of their rights, are considered, including those rights, but also making sure that our political systems are designed in a way that supports the protection and the safeguards of those rights. And I think, you know, your point about looking at human beings in all of its totality, you know, the future of our children and our children's children is important. And I think there's several initiatives, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion about the role of states in protecting future generations. Those are tools that we need to incorporate in our current advocacy here at the UNFCCC and across all UN processes, the UPR process, and so forth. We have to look at it under an overarching framework that's beyond the UNFCCC. And, you know, for Indigenous people, we're also looking at the rights of our ancestors to continue to live on through us. So looking behind in order to learn and looking forward in order to protect is the long view, I suppose, of doing this work. And that is a responsibility that we in this room hold. So with those words, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their nuggets of wisdom, and thank you all so much for being engaged. Yunakapakalebo.